Hey Optimancers, Treantmonk here. So we're going to be doing our 9th level spells now. So these are our wizard 9th level spells. We're going to see that the wizard spell list, if you look at your player's handbook, you're going to see the wizard spell list for 9th level spells is much bigger than any other classes. So we have the biggest selection of spells. Now with 9th level spells, we see a significant jump in power from 8th level spells. This is similar to what we saw when we went from 2nd level spells to 3rd level spells. Just a dramatic increase. Now, with this, we're really talking about moving our powerful wizard into the Archmage territory, where we can really just warp reality in ways that we've never been able to do before. But 9th level spells have a huge also variance in power level. There are some 9th level spells that will change your game. There are other 9th level spells that don't deserve to be 9th level spells. So our spell selection here is really vital. Now, if I'm a wizard, I'm only going to be able to cast one 9th level spell per game right up to level 20. But we might want to prepare more than one 9th level spell just because there's a significant variance of effects here. So for versatility reasons, we might want to prepare more than one 9th level spell just so we can have the spell we want for the situation. As usual, I'll be ranking these spells. Red means that the spell is not good enough to recommend. Orange means I think that the spell is too circumstantial, and because of that circumstantiality, I'm not recommending it. Purple means I think the spell is okay for the level. Now, okay for 9th level is pretty dramatic, but there are probably a lot better spells than that. Green means I am recommending this spell, and blue means I think this is one of those spells that if you look at it and you don't want it, you got to think about why you don't want it. It's so good. So as usual, I'll be doing each school of magic, and I'm going to be ranking from my favorite to my least favorite. So let's get started. So our first school that we're going to talk about is Abjuration, and the first spell on Abjuration is an amazing spell, Prismatic Wall. So we've seen a progression of these kinds of spells. At 4th level, we saw Autoluke's Resilient Sphere. 5th level, we went to Wall of Force. 7th level, we went to Force Cage. Now at 9th level, we have the ultimate wall spell, the Prismatic Wall spell. So why would we want Prismatic Wall over, say, a Force Cage? There are a number of reasons. The first is size. Prismatic Wall is a massive effect. So just like Wall of Force, we can create this as a straight wall, or we can create it as a sphere. But if we create it as a sphere, it's going to have a 15-foot radius or 30-foot diameter, so it's going to be able to fit just about anything you want in that effect. Now, it has to actually fit. If there's any part of it that is touching the sides, then the spell won't work. So you have to be able to actually encase the creature. If you encase the creature, it's stuck there, and it's stuck there like nothing else, because unlike with a Force Cage, there's no real way to bring this down. You would have to deal with each of the layers of the Prismatic Wall separately. So it would take action after action after action. Never mind the ability to do a wide range of different effects to be able to get out of a prismatic sphere. Now, if you just walk through a prismatic sphere, you can expect to take 175 points of damage and all kinds of secondary effects. So there's really no reason why to expect that a creature who's inside a prismatic sphere is ever going to be able to get out. The other reason why we might want to do Prismatic Sphere over a Force Cage is we can designate ourselves and our party members to not be affected by the sphere. So we can go in and out as we want. Only our enemies can't. So that is a distinction from those lower level spells that make this a better spell. Finally, this spell is going to create a bunch of light, and creatures that are near it within 20 feet might be blinded as well. But again, no friendly fire. We can choose ourselves and our party members to not be affected by that as well. So we're getting that blindness kind of as a free effect. The main point here is the sphere that is basically indestructible. So the limits we need to just be aware of is it has a 60-foot range and it has a 10-minute duration. So it's not going to be lasting forever, and we can't cast it just anywhere we want to. So those are really the only limitations you have to worry about with the Prismatic Wall. But if you like doing those wall spells, I certainly love doing those wall spells. You like the idea of encasing creatures and preventing them from getting out, and we like the versatility of being able to enter this area ourselves, deal with those creatures while they're stuck. Then Prismatic Wall is the ultimate spell for that. My next favorite spell for Abjuration at this level is Invulnerability. Now, Invulnerability does exactly what you would think it would do. It makes you immune to all damage. So if you cast the Invulnerability spell and you have 60 hit points, when the Invulnerability spell goes down, you will still have 60 hit points. There's no way to do any damage to somebody who has cast the Invulnerability spell. Now, that might not be as good as it sounds. The first thing to remember is it is going to use your concentration. So you will be concentrating on the effect. Now it's going to be pretty much impossible to break your concentration by doing damage, but it does prevent you from casting a lot of other spells because you're concentrating on this one. And the second thing to think about, and this is really important, is that remember that being invulnerable and being invincible are not the same thing. Just because you can't take hit points damage doesn't mean you can't be dealt with in other ways. You could still be petrified. You can still be restrained. You can still be imprisoned. So there are a lot of ways to defeat a creature that is invulnerable, besides bringing its hit points down to 0. This applies to you when you cast this spell. You're preventing taking damage from everything, but you will not be undefeatable. There's other ways to defeat you. Also, we have a duration of 10 minutes to think about as well. So once that 10 minutes is up, we may still have a fair bit of adventuring left to do, and we've used our 9th level slot. But when it comes to not taking damage, this is pretty much foolproof. You just are immune to all damage. So I do think this is a decent spell, but we need to keep in mind that just because you're invulnerable doesn't mean you can't be defeated. There are other things that can be done to you. We also have a costly component to think about here as well. It requires a piece of adamantine that's worth at least 500 gold pieces. So you will need to have that in stock if you plan to cast this spell. My least favorite Abjuration spell at this level is Imprisonment. This is again going to be one of those spells that if you're a DM and there's story reasons why you might want to have an Imprisonment spell in effect because we're bringing creatures from long ago or introducing creatures through an Imprisonment spell, you might want to include it in your campaign. But if you are a PC, you do not want the Imprisonment spell. Because it has a 1-minute casting time, it's not a combat spell. Outside of combat, you cast it on a single creature. They get a saving throw. If they make their saving throw, nothing happens. If they fail their saving throw, they are imprisoned. Now, if they're imprisoned, I guess that could do things like prevent them from being resurrected and dealing with them again and again if you have an enemy that keeps coming back, maybe. But because the Imprisonment spell is not a combat spell, it's not something that's going to come up outside of combat very often either. I really can't recommend this spell for either combat or out of combat. So for a PC, this is just not a spell you want to even consider. Again, if you're a DM and you're making a campaign and you're introducing somebody who was maybe gone 10,000 years ago, they disappeared, and you want to reintroduce them, you might want to look at something like the Imprisonment spell as a way that occurred. But when we're talking about a PC, just stay away from this one. So this brings us into our Conjuration spells. With Conjuration, we get the best spell in the game of D&D, and that is Wish. Now, you've probably heard about Wish before, because Wish is probably the best known spell in D&D as well. So, now, it's not exactly just a wish. You can't just cast it and get anything you want. There are limitations on the spell. But within those limitations, there's just a lot we can do. The first thing we can do is we can cast any spell in the game, whether it's on the wizard list or not, of level 8 or lower, except we change its casting time to 1 action, and we ignore any material components. So when this spell becomes exceptionally good is when we are simulating spells that would have a long casting time and or a costly material component that are reasonably high level spells. Now there are other things we can do with the wish as well. All of these things carry an element of risk and of payment for using it this way. But we could also use the wish to wish for wealth. We can get up to 25,000 gold pieces worth of wealth. We can do this mass healing effect that's better than anything else in the game. So where we just heal everyone up to full, we remove all their effects. We can give everybody resistance to a damage type. We can give everybody immunity to a spell of our choice. So there are a lot of other things we can do with a wish spell. But if we choose to do any of those things, then there will be a negative effect. First is any spell we cast after doing that, we're going to take damage. Our strength is going to drop to 3. This lasts for 2d4 days, so we can expect maybe 5 days. And then we have to spend those days resting in order to have those effects disappear. Finally, if we use Wish for any other effect other than duplicating a spell effect, there is a 1 in 3 chance we'll never be able to cast Wish again. That's a pretty steep payment to pay. This is your best spell. This is the best spell in the game. You make it so that your character can never use that spell again. So if I was going to use Wish for anything other than a spell effect, it better be maybe near the end of the campaign or an all or nothing scenario. We're looking at a campaign ending, debilitating thing happening, and we're going to cast Wish to get out of it. But in regular campaigning, I would probably avoid doing Wish for anything other than spell effects. Now, I listed a few things there. I should mention also, you can turn back time. You can have somebody go back and re-roll a roll that maybe they failed. And also, you could potentially do other things as well. It's really up to your DM what you can wish for. But remember, any wish other than duplicating a spell effect is going to be risky and it's going to be pretty painful. Now, I'm basically saying that with Wish, for the most part, what we're doing is we're replicating spells of 8th level or lower. Now, 8th level spells and lower are significantly less powerful than 9th level spells. So we're going to get an effect that maybe is less powerful than a 9th level spell. However, because we can avoid those longer casting times, because we can avoid costly material components, there's certain spells we can duplicate with Wish that are going to be really effective even as a 9th level spell. So I'm going to give you a really short list of spells that I think are pretty good choices for a Wish spell. The first is Simulacrum. This one I've talked about before. I think it's kind of the most obvious use of a Wish spell. Remember, Simulacrum is effectively a permanent effect. So we can cast this in our off time if we want to. And Simulacrum normally has a long casting time, costly material component, and we can avoid both those things. So this is one of those things that if we're about to take a long rest, I still have my 9th level slot available. If I don't have a Simulacrum already, this is a perfect choice for our Wish spells to cast a Simulacrum before that long rest. Second spell I like to duplicate with a Wish spell is Find Greater Steed. But again, this is a permanent effect. So when we're in our off time, getting yourself a Pegasus or a Griffin makes a lot of sense because it is going to continue to last out of that off time, and we can bring it adventuring with us. And you can have a flying mount that's going to make you move very quickly. Useful thing to have. We can access it through a Wish spell. Another spell I like to duplicate with a Wish spell is a Hero's Feast. So a Hero's Feast is going to give our entire party immunity to poison. Normally this is a difficult spell to cast for clerics because there is a costly material component. But we can avoid that costly material component so we can give everyone the benefits of a Hero's Feast for free. Another spell I like to duplicate with a Wish spell is Magic Jar. So Magic Jar is normally a spell that we would need to be casting outside of combat because of a long casting time. With a Wish spell, we can cast it in combat because now we can do it as a one-action cast. This is the kind of thing that I might want to do if my character's about to go down. So if my character's been taking damage, I'm about to go down, I could do a Magic Jar, then my body collapses, maybe stops being a target. Now I can do the Magic Jar effects on my round and maybe possess an enemy creature. Another two spells I'm going to talk about that we might want to duplicate with a Wish spell are Mighty Fortress and Temple of the Gods. So these have somewhat similar effects in that we're creating kind of a home base that's readily defendable. Both these spells require more time to cast. With a Wish spell, we can cast them with a single action. We could even have a Mighty Fortress spell as a combat spell. So we cast the Mighty Fortress and suddenly we're in a castle and we can defend ourselves. That would make a pretty dramatic effect to most combats. Another spell worthy of looking at using with a wish is Symbol. So Symbol is a spell that normally is difficult to implement. I normally don't recommend the Symbol spell, but if we can cast it with a single action and no material component, suddenly Symbol is a pretty good combat spell. Another spell we might want to consider is Glyph of Warding. So Glyph of Warding, again, normally has this limitation. We can use Glyph of Warding to cast a spell on ourselves, and that spell wouldn't require concentration even if it normally would. But because with a wish we can cast it as a single action, we could potentially cast a Glyph of Warding in combat and then hit ourselves with some kind of buff spell that would normally require concentration, and we can remove that concentration requirement. So hit yourself with concentration-free improved invisibility, for example. Now, generally the effects we'd be looking at are lower level. This isn't something I'd necessarily jump to, but if we're building up our buffing, it is a way to stack on a little more. And the final spell I'd probably be looking at using a wish for is Resurrection. And this essentially becomes the better combat Revivify spell. So usually with raised dead effects, these are things that can't be done during combat because the casting time is too long. Revivify being the lone exception to that. But if we use a wish to cast a resurrection spell, number one, we avoid the costly material component, and number two, we can do it with a single action. And now we can bring ally up to full hit points. Now, a resurrected creature still has a minus to attack rolls and things like that. That lasts like for 4 days. But if we want to bring back, say, a spellcaster instantly back into the combat, we will still find them really effective, and they'll appreciate having all their hit points compared to having a Revivify spell cast on them. Now, these are just some examples. Obviously, we can cast any spell of 8th level or lower with a wish spell. These are kind of the spells that I would gravitate to. And at the end of the day, if you haven't cast your wish spell, cast it. Cast it as a simulacrum, or get yourself a Find Greater Steed, or something. There's usually going to be some way you can use your wish spell that you can at least use that 9th level slot before the end of the day, because sometimes you're waiting, right? You're in a combat and you have that wish there and it's kind of your ace in the hole because you're waiting for the moment where it's going to be the perfect casting. And that never comes. So then we're going to finish our day. We're going to take a long rest. We haven't used it. Cast it then. Cast it on something at that point. Something that's going to have a duration that it's going to last past when you get up the next day. Now, my least favorite Conjuration spell at this level is Gate. So Gate has a costly component, 5,000 gold pieces. It's not used up, so each time you cast a spell, you can use the same component. And what it's going to do is it's going to create a portal, and that portal can travel to another plane. Now, if we're doing plane travel, Gate is the most effective way to do that. We can move through lots of creatures. It is completely effective. There's none of this near the area we want it to be. It's going to go exactly where we want it to go. Also, if there's a creature and we want to bring it through the gate, we can do that if we know its true name. But there are some things here. So first, travel with the 9th level spell. 9th level spells are better than travel spells. So for the most part, I'm not going to want to spend a 9th level spell on planar travel. I could cast a 7th level spell on planar travel. The second thing is, if we bring a creature through, it's not like that creature is in any way subservient to us. So unless that's already a friendly creature, we're not necessarily helping ourselves at all. So if you learn the true name of a demon, for example, you're probably not going to want to pull it through a gate in a combat because it's going to attack you instead of your enemies, and there's no real way to deal with that. Now, I've heard there's some creative uses where maybe you could put it under a creature and then they fall through it and then they're basically banished to another plane, except that gate is going to remain there, so they might be able to come back as well. Overall, I just don't think there's enough here. This is planar travel. Yes, it's safe. Yes, it's accurate. But it's planar travel as a 9th level spell. There are other ways we could planar travel at lower levels. Not quite as accurate, but certainly safe. So I'm not sure what Gate is really bringing that warrants a 9th level spell slot. That brings us into Divination. My favorite Divination spell, the only Divination spell, but it's a pretty good one, is Foresight. So Foresight, we can cast it on ourselves, or we can cast it on another party member. And quite often we might want to choose to cast it on another party member instead, especially a party member that relies on attacks. Something like a sharpshooter or a great weapon master is going to get a lot out of a Foresight. It's going to give you an 8-hour duration, no concentration, and they basically get advantage on all their rolls, and attack rolls against them are going to have disadvantage. So that's on every roll. That's going to end up being a lot of rolls. Now, when you have a creature that is going to benefit immensely from advantage, like a great weapon master, like a sharpshooter, this is going to increase their damage potential a lot. We're also going to help keep those creatures alive because all the attacks against them have disadvantage. They're going to have advantage on all their saving throws, and if they're doing any ability checks, those will have advantage as well. Remember, that's things like initiative as well. So it just is a gift that keeps on giving. Now, advantage, there's lots of other ways to grant advantage in the game, but when we're granting advantage to everything, and every attack has disadvantage, this becomes a really substantial buff, certainly far better than any other buff in the game, and worthy of recommendation. So this brings us to our enchantment spells. There are 2 enchantment spells, and I'm not a big fan of either of them. The first one is Power Word Kill. Now, Power Word Kill, I talked about Power Word Stun before. Power Word Kill suffers the same problem. So we cast Power Word Kill on a creature, and if it has 100 hit points or fewer, it dies. But if it has 101 hit points or more, nothing happens. Now, the first problem, of course, is we don't know when a creature has less than 100 hit points. And the second problem, of course, is when we're 17th level or higher, 100 hit points isn't a lot. That means that we could potentially just do the 100 hit points worth of damage and kill that creature without using a 9th level slot. Lots of our party members are going to be in that range of damage. Certainly the party as a whole can be doing more than 100 points of damage around at this point. So being able to kill a creature that has 100 hit points or less isn't very useful. Now, there are circumstances where it could be useful. What if that creature is cast, say, an invulnerability spell? Well, then we could do something like a Power Word Kill and kill them. So there are unique circumstances where this could be useful. So I'm going to give it an orange rating for that reason. But with an orange rating, I'm not recommending this spell because I think those are too circumstantial to recommend this spell. In regular combat, it's just too hard to implement this spell. We're going to be facing creatures with hundreds and hundreds of hit points. We have no idea when they've gotten below 100 hit points, and once they've gotten below 100 hit points, we've almost won already. The other enchantment spell at this level is Psychic Scream. Now, Psychic Scream is a blast spell, and as far as blast spells go, there are a number of things about this spell that almost redeem it. The first is it only has a somatic component. That means that even if you were in an area, say, of silence, you could cast a Psychic Scream spell. The second is it has no friendly fire, so we can cast it as a blast right over our party, and our party's not going to be affected. The enemies are. That's lovely to have. It can affect up to 10 creatures. That's a pretty good amount of creatures to affect. And they make intelligence saving throws. And intelligence saving throws is the best saving throw to target, generally speaking. I mean, again, we're better off if we don't target a save at all. But when we target 10 creatures with an intelligence saving throw, we can expect a reasonable amount of them to fail that save. But the downsides here are significant. The first is it is a damage spell, and the damage is terrible. 14d6 damage with a 9th level spell is awful damage. If we compare it to something like a Meteor Swarm that is specifically for doing damage and does it over a much bigger area and does more than double the damage of this, it shows you how little 14d6 damage is. And of course, save for half. Now, this spell stuns the creatures, but they get a saving throw every round to remove that stun as well. Also, if a creature has 2 intelligence or less, they're unaffected by the spell. So again, we need that kind of sweet spot. That spot where they're over the 2 intelligence, but they don't have a high intelligence, because if they do, then targeting intelligence wasn't such a great thing in the first place. Also, the main creatures we're fighting, they have legendary resistance, so they can choose to make their saving throw. So I'm going to give this spell an orange rating because I do think there are circumstances where it could be a very effective spell. If I'm facing 10 enemy creatures, they don't have legendary resistance, they don't have a great intelligence or a great intelligence saving throw, I can potentially stun. I might be able to stun all 10 of them. And they may not be able to make their saving throw. It might be impossible for them to make their saving throw at all. If that happens, they're permanently stunned because this isn't a duration spell. This spell lasts until they make that saving throw. So in the right circumstances, we could potentially permanently stun 10 creatures. That's amazing. So again, this is an orange rating spell because the damage just doesn't cut it. But the stun effect could be really effective if we're facing the right creatures and we're facing the right number of creatures to make it worth a 9th level slot. So I can't recommend this spell because how often does that happen? Once in a while. Not often enough to warrant a 9th level spell preparation, in my opinion. So this brings us into Evocation, and we get the ultimate blast spell in the game, Meteor Swarm. Now, for the most part, I'm not a huge fan of spells that do damage because they tend not to do enough damage to warrant the spell slot. When I have a wizard who can do as much damage as the fighter by casting a blast spell, I'm using a resource and the fighter is not, so that's generally not worth it. Now with Area of Effect, I could potentially do that damage to a number of creatures. But again, if it's not enough damage to significantly impact them, so we have creatures maybe have 150 hit points and we're doing 20 points of damage to them, we may not see that as a significant impact on the battle. Certainly as significant as other spell effects we could do. But Meteor Swarm's kind of an exception here. Meteor Swarm, number one, the range is a mile. So we can do this when we can't cast any other spells. We could still do a Meteor Swarm. The area is absolutely massive. 40-foot radius. That's 80-foot diameter. That's going to basically cover most of your battle map. And it does 40d6 damage. So 40d6 damage, that's going to be about 120 hit points save for half. That is a significant amount of hit points even at this level. And again, now I would never do a Meteor Swarm on a single creature. 120 hit points to a single creature is not worth the 9th level slot. But if we can fit 50 creatures, and it's totally conceivable that we could fit 50 creatures in the area here, then the amount of damage here, we're talking in the thousands. Now, I'm not going to be taking out a bunch of minions here that maybe have 10 hit points each, but what if you have an army of minions with 100 hit points each? Then a Meteor Swarm could just clear the battlefield. Now, the disadvantage here is pretty obvious, I think. There is friendly fire on this effect, and it is a massive area. That means in some areas, if we're in a dungeon, for example, we might find it hard to place a Meteor Swarm where we don't hit our party. And that's a non-starter. You never ever want to hit your party with a Meteor Swarm. It's so much damage, you might take party members out. So we might want to think about that where we're adventuring, whether this is worthwhile to prepare. If we're adventuring, crawling through a dungeon, I probably wouldn't go with Meteor Swarm unless, if I am an evoker, of course, I can designate party members to not be affected by this. Now, technically, I could still be affected too, so placement is still important, but it's going to be much, much easier for us to place this effect where we can hit the enemies, not hit our allies, and we just have to make sure that we're far enough range away that it doesn't hit us. So for an evoker, this is the obvious choice for a 9th level spell. If you're playing a blaster, this is the ultimate blast spell. Of course you should take it, and as an evoker, you're going to find the spell is even better for you than it is for other casters. So this brings us to Illusion, and Illusion has one spell. It is the worst 9th level spell in the game, and if it was an 8th level spell, it would be the worst 8th level spell in the game. Honestly, I would think that this spell should be about a 5th level spell. That's how bad it is for a 9th level spell, and this spell is Weird. Weird is an incredibly ineffective spell for the level. So what Weird does is it's essentially a mass frighten ability, similar to the 3rd level spell Fear. Really similar to the 3rd level spell Fear. So we're going to center it on our enemies. Friendly fire is a possibility, so we want to make sure that our allies aren't nearby. Those enemies will make wisdom saving throws, and if they make their wisdom saving throws, nothing happens. If they fail their wisdom saving throw, they're frightened. Now, that's it, right? We could have done that with the third level fear spell. In terms of placing a sphere over a cone, I will say I prefer the sphere. So in terms of area of effect, I would prefer the weird spell to the fear spell, but it's not a runaway. Now, if they were hit with a fear spell, a third level fear spell, they wouldn't get a second saving throw until they were out of range. But with this spell, they get a saving throw every round, and if they make that second saving throw, it ends the effect. So in a lot of cases, we might be looking at not frightened at all because they made their first saving throw, or frightened for one round because they made their second saving throw with a 9th level spell. Now, if they fail those 2 saving throws in a row, then they take damage, and that damage is 4d10 psychic damage, which is absolutely pathetic damage for the level, considering they have to fail 2 saving throws in a row to take it. Now, each round after that, they could potentially take another 4d10 damage, so it could potentially be a lot of damage if they just fail saving throw after saving throw after saving throw, round after round after round. They could potentially take a lot of damage. But if you have creatures that can fail every single saving throw, why are you wasting 9th level slots on these creatures? You could have defeated them with a much, much lower level spell. Weird, I just don't see any circumstances where Weird is worth a 9th level slot, and I absolutely think it is the worst 9th level spell in the game. Would probably be the worst 8th level spell in the game. Like I said, if this was a 5th level spell, I might consider making it purple, maybe. Even then, I'm not sure it's worth 5th level, maybe 4th level slot. Maybe if it was a 4th level slot. I really have no idea how this made it into the 9th level spell list. If this was a proper 9th level spell, there would be no initial saving throw, and the damage would occur on the first round. And then maybe then they get additional saving throws on subsequent rounds. Maybe also we would not have friendly fire. If we did all those things, this would be an okay 9th level spell. It does none of those things. This is just not worth it. And I would just stay far away from the weird spell. So this brings us to our Necromancy spells. There's only one, it's Astral Projection. Kind of a weird spell to be under Necromancy, but Astral Projection is a planar travel spell. Specifically, it allows you to travel through the astral plane, and you can potentially access other planes from the astral plane. Or maybe you're just adventuring in the astral plane because there are things there. There are cities there, entire races exist in the astral plane, like the Githyanki. So there is a costly component that to cast this spell, but it is not used up, and we move all our creatures into the astral realm. Now what happens is our actual characters remain in the prime material plane or wherever we cast the spell from in suspended animation. So our actual characters aren't traveling. It is these astral forms. They're connected by a silver cord, and the spell kind of references that if the silver cord is cut, the character dies, but there's almost no way for that to occur. So don't worry about that. The only way currently written in the rules that I'm aware of is a Githyanki silver sword might be able to cut the silver cord. That's just not likely to happen. Silver swords are like artifacts. It's not something you're going to come up against very likely in most scenarios. So your astral forms are basically safe, and if they die, and then you simply reawaken in your actual body. So there's not a lot of risk in this spell. Now, the forms that are traveling through the astral plane have all your statistics, they have all your abilities, they have all your equipment, and duplicates of them. So if you have consumables, if you have potions or spell scrolls, go ahead and use them up, right? There's no reason not to, because your main character still on the prime material plane will maintain those consumables. So don't worry about any of those things. So this becomes an incredibly safe and reliable way to travel through the astral plane. And we can access other planes through portals on the astral plane as well. Now the problem with this spell is, and I think it's pretty obvious, how often are we traveling through the astral plane? How often do we need to travel through the astral plane? If we don't need to travel through the astral plane, this is a useless spell. We might use it for planar travel, but again, we have lower level spells that can do planar travel easier than this spell. So if we need to travel in the astral plane, this is perfect, and it's a powerful spell. If we don't need to travel in the astral plane, I don't see a lot of use here. So this becomes an orange spell. It's circumstantial, really good in the right circumstance, but if we're not traveling through the astral plane, there's no real point to it. So finally, we get to our transmutation spells, and we have a few spells to go through here. The first spell I'm going to talk about, the best transmutation spell, really good spell, is True Polymorph. So True Polymorph is the ultimate polymorph spell. If we are in combat and we want to turn into a dragon, we can turn into a dragon. We can turn our allies into dragons. We can turn the enemy dragon into a tree. We can turn trees into allied dragons. And that's just dragons. Of course, we can do anything. So the versatility here is astounding. We can use it as a buff. We can use it as a debuff. We can use it as a summon. Also, if we concentrate on this spell for the full hour, the effect is permanent until dispelled. So what we can do is we could maybe turn an ally into a dragon, and after an hour, they are a dragon. Now, unless they are reduced to 0 hit points or a dispel magic is cast on them, it lasts forever. Now, I read online a lot of people talking about the Ancient Brash Dragon, because an Ancient Brash Dragon is a CR 20 creature, gargantuan dragon, about 300 hit points, and that this would be the ultimate form to transform an ally into. Personally, I think the adult gold dragon is the superior choice for a multitude of reasons. The first is the gold dragon is a lower challenge rating, and I don't know why. If you compare the stats of these creatures together, the gold dragon probably should be the higher challenge rating. But it is lower, 17, which means when we first get this spell at 17th level, we can already transmute an ally into a gold dragon. The gold dragon is going to have a little less hit points than an Ancient Brash Dragon, but not a lot less. We're talking about 256 compared to 297. Now, in terms of armor class, again, the gold dragon is a little less, 19 compared to 20. Size is a big thing, though. The adult gold dragon is huge. The Ancient Brash Dragon is gargantuan. Huge is going to fit into more campaigns, be able to do more things than a gargantuan creature. That's going to be a problem with a lot of things. Actually, the huge is going to be a problem with a lot of things too. Now, the dragon can shape change into a humanoid form, but humanoid form isn't necessarily the best form because you can't do a lot of your dragon things like the big claws and the breath weapon and stuff. Now, when it comes to breath weapon, the gold dragon's breath weapon is better. They have the same DC, but the gold dragon's does more damage. Now, when it comes to frightful presence, the gold dragon is much better. We're talking about a DC of 21 compared to a DC of 18. So overall, I think the gold dragon's a better choice. Do we want to transform our party members into gold dragons? Maybe. It really depends on what the players want to do. I have played a campaign where I had my character transformed into an adult gold dragon, and it was fun. Just because you change everything up. Your normal class features all disappear. They're replaced by the gold dragon features, but I had a ton more hit points. The breath weapon was fun to use. The frightful presence was fun to use. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I was better as a gold dragon, just different. It was fine. And in that campaign, most of the time the huge form wasn't a problem. When it was, I transformed into a humanoid. But not all players are going to be excited about giving up all their class abilities, all their spells. Now, there's some wording in the True Polymorph spell that suggests that you might be able to continue to cast spells if you take a form capable of casting spells. But if we look at another part of the True Polymorph spell, it says that your statistics are completely replaced by the statistics of the creature. So if that creature doesn't have spells on its own, you don't retain your class spells, whatever spells you had before you were transformed. So there's a lot of players who aren't going to want their characters transformed into dragons. So it's not necessarily just an upgrade for everybody. Though it's not necessarily permanent either. Remember, if you go to 0 hit points or it's dispelled, you would revert to your initial form. As basically a summoning spell, this is okay. We could change, like I said, a rock into a challenge rating 9 creature. there's reasonably good challenge rating 9 creatures. Now, at this level, they're not amazing, but there's so much to choose from that this can be a reasonable summon spell. You do have to concentrate on it. Remember that. Now, once we concentrating on it for an hour, it's effectively permanent, but you lose control of the creature at that point. So this is really a summon spell that requires concentration with a duration of an hour that can do up to a challenge rating 9 creature. Not a great use of this spell. There are other summon spells that would be able to do a similar effect with a lower level slot, so I wouldn't generally recommend that, but it creates some versatility. Finally, targeting an enemy creature to turn them into a rock or a tree or whatever. Generally, I'm not going to do that, right? Because it's targeting a single creature. They make a saving throw. If they make that saving throw, nothing happens. But it's just one more way that we can use this spell. So we're just adding the versatility. So as an add-on, I'll take it just fine. But I'm probably not going to use that. Most of the time, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be transmuting friendly creatures into powerful creatures. Also keep in mind that the ally that you transform, all their equipment changes with them. So they will not be able to access that equipment while they're transformed. It will return once the spell ends. This brings us to my second favorite transmutation spell at this level, which is Shapechange. So this is a self-only buff, and in some ways it seems similar to a true polymorph spell, but it is fairly different. First off, it's self-only, and it is only really usable as a buff. But what will happen is you can transform into any creature of your challenge rating or lower, or your level or lower with a wizard. So if you're a 17th level wizard, you can turn into a 17 challenge rating creature, like the adult gold dragon I talked about before. You get the creature's hit points, but what we can do is we can change forms every round that we have this spell. We just use an action, we can take a different form. It can never have more hit points than we had before. So those hit points are generally going to work their way down to the point where we lose this spell. We also don't get any spellcasting ability of the creature we take, but if it has innate spellcasting, we do. And if you look at the various innate spellcasting abilities of creatures throughout the Monster Manual, throughout Volos, throughout Mordenkainen's, there are a lot of different spells we can access with this spell. And remember, because we can change forms every round, we could go to one creature, use its innate spellcasting, go to another creature, use its innate spellcasting. So that could be a tremendous amount of spells that we add to our ability to cast. Finally, we are going to retain our own mental ability scores. We're going to retain our own spellcasting. Now, we have to move into a creature that would be capable of spellcasting. So if it has a somatic component, it must be able to do a somatic component, etc. Your DM is going to probably make those decisions, but there's some stuff that's reasonably obvious. If you're going to turn into, say, an astral diva, you're likely going to be able to cast your spells. If you're going to turn into a dragon, you're likely going to be able to cast your spells. If you're going to turn into a roper, you might find it hard to do something like your somatic components. This is a concentration spell, so if you take damage, you might lose that concentration. So as a combat spell, it's not perfect. But there's still an incredible amount of versatility here. The ability to access all these different spells by changing forms, the ability to maintain your own spellcasting ability, your own class abilities, really, in certain ways, make this a significantly better spell than a true polymorph spell. Though there is a lack of versatility there because it's only usable on yourself. It's basically just a buff, and it can't be made permanent. But I still think this is a good spell and one worthy considering for your 9th level slot. My next favorite spell at this level is Time Stop. Now, Time Stop, there's a bit of controversy as to whether Time Stop's a good spell or a bad spell. I think it's an okay spell. When we cast it, we roll a d4, we get that many turns plus 1, where everybody else is frozen in time. So basically, we're getting a bunch of free actions. Now, there are limitations on what we can do. We can't be doing damage to other creatures because they are frozen in time. But what we can do is we can set up things. We might cast a force cage around somebody. We might set delayed blast fireballs to go off when it comes up. We might raise some illusions. We might do some self-buffing. What it does is it allows us to layer up some stuff that we might not have been able to do if we were stuck in combat, because once we do the time stop, we're effectively out of the combat. Do I think that's amazing? I think it's okay. For 9th level spell, we're talking about the top level of spell. I think this is an okay spell. I don't think it is great. I don't think it is terrible. I've heard both sides of that story. Getting a bit of free, guaranteed time to set up the effects we want to do. Remember, as a wizard, doing damage isn't really our primary purpose anyway. Probably things like setting up illusions and walls and buffing is what we do regardless. Being able to do a few free rounds of that is pretty good. Is it worth a 9th level slot? Maybe. I think it's okay. And that will move on to our final spell for Transmutation, which I also think is an okay spell, and that's Mass Polymorph. So Mass Polymorph is very similar to the 4th level Polymorph spell. And unlike that spell, we can target 10 creatures. There's a few other minor differences as well. Things like the creature's hit points become temporary hit points instead of you just replacing your hit points with the hit points of the creature. These are reasonably minor things. The main thing is we're choosing 10 creatures and we get the Polymorph spell on 10 of them. We still have to concentrate on it. Like with Polymorph, we can use it as a buff or we can use it as a debuff. My issue with this spell is that I've talked about this with Polymorph. At 7th level, Polymorph is a game-changing spell, the most powerful spell for that level, but it doesn't scale very well. So by the time we get to 10th level, 11th level, Polymorph is an okay spell at best. By the time we get to 15th level, Polymorph is a bad spell. And Mass Polymorph hasn't really improved the effects of the Polymorph itself. It's just changed the number of creatures we can polymorph. So it's changed the number of creatures we can polymorph, but it's still not a good buff. So as a buff, unless we have creatures that are significantly lower level than us, it's not a good buff. But we can still use it on 10 enemy creatures and potentially turn 10 enemy creatures into earthworms. That's okay. There may be party members, there may be companions to party members that we could use a polymorph on and turn them into a T-Rex or a giant ape, and that might be a boost for them. In those cases, it's an okay buff, not amazing for 9th level. So overall, this is an okay spell. I'm not particularly overwhelmed by this spell. When we look at other polymorph effects of this level, like True Polymorph and Shapechange, I don't think this is at that power level. But I don't think it's a terrible spell either. It's certainly a lot better than a spell like, say, Weird. I think you will find that Mass Polymorph, if you use it, it's going to be okay. Probably worth a 9th level slot, but not your best option for your 9th level slot. And that is all the 9th level spells in the game. And now we are going to be talking about class builds. So we've gone over everything now. I went over the subclasses, the races, what equipment they might use, what spells they might take. So now let's start building wizards. And we're going to do every subclass of wizards. Some of them are going to be multi-class, some of them are going to be single-classed, because there's a lot of wizards to do. But I'm going to start with a primer video. So the next wizard video I'll be doing, we're going to be talking about the builds to come. So I'm going to kind of preview all the different builds that we're going to make over the coming weeks. Until then, I am going to sit back and I am going to relax. And I'm going to have some fun, because D&D is for everyone. Thanks, Optimancers. See you next time.